All right. Welcome everybody. Another edition of Legend Sports, and this is Amplify, where we're talking baseball history, Negro League history, card art, collecting, you name it. We've had everybody on here in the last couple of weeks, and I'm really happy to have on local Houston resident like I am, and Saber member and author researcher Frederick Bush. How you doing, Rick?
Doing great, Philip. Thanks for having me on.
You got it, man. I appreciate it. This will be fun. We're going to talk a little bit about the Negro Leagues, and we're going to talk about the Summer of Sabre and a few other things that you're involved in as far as your research and your writings. And but I think I was telling you before we got on here, one thing I think I like to hear, and people have enjoyed hearing, is how people like yourself, because I started doing this because there are so many authors and researchers out there, historians that have been at this for a long time, and they got into it for a reason. And I like hearing that origin story, how people got interested in this, especially the Negro Leagues, because up until recently, the vast majority of people, they don't really have. It's a high level maybe, but they don't really have as much knowledge on it as you know
Right.
they maybe could. So, how did you get into all this?
Well, I have been a lifelong baseball fan. So I've always had an interest in, I want to say, most things baseball. Uh, I'm not honestly that interested in the dead ball era or anything, but once you get into the modern era, everything is interesting to me. And I've always, tried to read a lot about baseball history. There wasn't, like you said, for a long time, there wasn't that much to read about the Negro Leagues.
Hmm.
But what really stoked my interest, believe it or not, was a children's book that I read with my oldest son when he was in second grade. And he checked it out of the library. He takes after his dad. He's a huge baseball fan too. All three of my boys are. And it was a little bit above his reading level. So I said, well, we'll read it together. And it was a fictionalization of the 1948 Birmingham Black Barons. And it's written by Walter Dean Myers. He's deceased now, but the title of the book is The Journal of Biddy Owens. And Biddy Owens is a fictional character, but Myers had really done his research, and all of the actual players that were on that team, including 17-year-old Willie Mays,
Cool.
are characters in the story. And like I said, it's sort of a fictionalization of their season, which was the season that had the last Negro Leagues World Series between the Black Barons and the Homestead Grays. And so we read that, and he became interested in some of them. He was a big enough baseball fan as a second grader already to know who Willie Mays was. But he got interested in some of the others, and in particular, Bill Grieston.
Uh-huh.
And so he asked me, he said, how many of these guys are still alive? And I said, I don't know. So I went about finding out. And at that time already, only Mays, Grieston, and Jim Zapp were still living. All the others had passed away. And so I thought, well, this is really interesting to me. And I decided to write Bill Grieston's biography, Saber biography, for Saber's Biography Project. While I was researching that, I was just fascinated by the whole thing. And so I knew Bill Nowlin at the time was the one who oversaw all of the Saber book projects. And we had just worked on one about the Houston Astrodome, as a matter of fact. And so I ran this idea about him. I said, hey, what about a Negro Leagues book featuring the two teams that played in that last Negro League World Series? That's a pretty landmark event. And he liked that idea. And so, we got that to happen. Saber members wrote biographies of all the players on both teams. We had articles about the World Series and other articles that gave context to the end of the Negro Leagues, how integration, brought about their quick demise. Those players that couldn't make it to the white minor or major leagues that went to Canada or went to the Latin American leagues, all those types of contextual articles there. And I think that book was so well received that now we're in the middle of a series. We just published the fourth one on the 1942 Kansas City Monarchs. In between, we had the 1946 Newark Eagles and the 1935 Pittsburgh Crawfords. And we're already working on the 1920 Chicago American Giants for next year and the 1934 Philadelphia Stars for 2 years from now. So with each passing book, it's just become something that I've gone deeper and deeper into it. I don't just write for the books. I came into contact via the first book project with the youngest daughter of Johnny Wright, who of course was the second Negro League player signed after Jackie Robinson. Went through that spring training in 1946 with Robinson with the Montreal Royals. Started the season with the Royals, though he wound up being optioned down to Three Rivers, but he won a championship with the Three Rivers team. And we're working on a book about her father. She's been sort of doing the, cool. I don't want to say lecture circuit, but ESPN and other outlets have interviewed her. She's been getting the word out more about her father, who kind of became the forgotten man since he did not become the star in the major leagues that Jackie Robinson did. But certainly he has had a career worthy of telling. He won championships everywhere he went. And had he come along, even Jackie Robinson said, had he come along maybe 2-3 years into integration and the pressure not being so much on him, he likely would have succeeded as well. So we were also trying to work on getting together a book about her father. She's got a treasure trove of pictures and documents and that sort of thing as well that I think is really going to be a worthwhile project. So doing all those kind of things has really been fun. And there's some reward in getting the word out about, this whole group of largely forgotten players, other than the ones that have, in the interim, of course, become Hall of Famers.
And not enough of those yet, unfortunately, but maybe more coming. Who knows? But it's an awesome. I think your story kind of sums up how it is with a lot of people. You maybe have a little bit of knowledge about it. You're a baseball fan. I know my story is almost exactly the same. Back in the late 80s, I was working for the AAA team for the Phillies, the Scranton Wilkes-Barre Red Barons, and Reggie Jackson hosted a Negro League Players Association benefit night in 1992. And I got to meet all these guys. And up to that point, I was really into baseball history, and I loved trivia, and I was into playing Stratomatic and all kinds of baseball, related things, playing baseball. But then I hear these stories, and it just opened up, I was missing half the story. And it's just, ever since then, it'd be very few days, if any days go by, that I am not talking about it with somebody, trying to point something out. That's why I'm having these, like I mentioned to you, to try to get the word out on people and try to get people interested, because it's all around them, and they just need to maybe look around the corner, and you're going to find something that has to do with a Negro League barnstorming tour, a player, a team, something in their neighborhood. So
Exactly. There's so many interesting stories. If you go back in baseball history, period, when baseball truly was the national pastime, when there was no NFL and college football was a bigger game than professional, but it wasn't baseball. Basketball, there was no NBA yet, and what there was not as big as baseball. When every town had a team, when businesses had teams, and these Negro League teams, of course, not only played within their leagues, and of course there were some teams that weren't part of a league at all. They were just barnstorming teams, and they went around and played all of these teams as well. If they could find a place to play in the team that would play them, and there were even just a few dollars to be made that would keep their team in business and keep them going, they would do it. So you get these teams playing everywhere.
Yep.
And it's really just fascinating, the whole of baseball history, but especially the way these teams barnstormed, and like I said, even the league teams had to do that to stay afloat.
That's right.
And so, these days with digitized newspaper archives and everything, it's so much easier to dig into a lot of that. You don't have to be a traveling researcher necessarily. There are still some things where obviously, and if you can't go there, you maybe try to contact a local researcher or something. But like I said, with all the newspaper archives, newspapers.com, genealogybank.com, and of course, with everything that's on ancestry.com, there's so much more information to be found these days.
That's right.
That you can really dig in. And any player's story to me is fascinating. Whether I've written about Negro leaguers or major leaguers, I've written about Hall of Famers, and I've written about guys who played part of one season. And sometimes the guys who played part of one season have a more interesting overall life story than the guys that were Hall of Famers, because the Hall of Famers were mostly just about baseball. Those other guys, had other things going on in their lives because they didn't last long in baseball, but a lot of times interesting what they did and how they tried to stay in baseball for a longer period of time.
There are so many stories, and like you pointed out, the one thing I've tried to stress in all these talks I've been having, and so people are watch them understand that the Negro Leagues had such a huge impact on spreading that baseball brand around, like you're talking about, through the barnstorming and to every single part of the country, the continent, even Latin America, Canada, you name it. And so if you look around and you there's probably some impact, some footprint that was there, and I'm hoping to get people interested in finding out more. That's the whole thing about this, is that there's so much more to be uncovered. And will it all be uncovered? Unfortunately, probably not. But it doesn't discount what we do know, and it doesn't discount what has been recently in the news with the Major League Baseball announcement of recognizing the leagues and Baseball Reference and so forth. So let's start with that. Let's start with, and then we'll talk about the books you mentioned as well, and a little bit about Saber.
Sure.
But one of the things that there isn't a lot of pushback, because, like I said, most people tend to not know as much about it. But one thing is that in all this, no one's trying to sensationalize anything nor mythologize these guys. I mean, it's telling the story like it is, right? And so when Baseball Reference made that announcement, the thing that I heard from some elements, well, they were playing against, like you're talking about, the local town team, and they were playing against, lesser talent, and they didn't have an organized league, and they didn't have this, and they didn't have that, and they didn't have this. All of that doesn't matter. Fact is, these guys were good enough.
And what you're talking about there is what people don't understand. Those statistics that are on Baseball Reference, those, of course, are what is on. Did I just lose you?
Nope, you're there. I got you.
No, okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry. Something changed on my screen. I didn't want to be. Those statistics are coming from the seamheads.com Negro League database.
Right.
And what Seamheads has done, and therefore what Baseball Reference is doing now, is they are only using statistics from league games, from those 7 leagues that have been acknowledged as being, major leagues from the period between 1920 and 1948. So you're not getting the statistics from when they played, the local meat packing plant or anything like that. I've communicated a lot with Gary Ashwill, who's the main mover and shaker behind that. And whenever I discover something that they don't have on Seamheads, I send it his way. Or if I can't find something, I ask him if he's got it. Yep. And he said, at some point, maybe further down the line, they will also add those other stats and obviously differentiate which are league stats and which then would be the equivalent of exhibition stats. But what's on Baseball Reference, those are major league statistics. And to say that the Negro leagues, those leagues that are considered major league now, were not leagues, that's just, incorrect.
That's right.
They were leagues.
That's right.
Now maybe that some of the teams were owned by so occasionally shady characters, that kind of thing. The Negro League players were sort of almost the ultimate free agents. I mean, they had contracts. That's another misconception, that they didn't even have contracts. Yes, they did. They had contracts modeled after, the white major leagues' contracts. The thing was, it was harder to hold them to it. And many Negro leaguers were not above jumping their contract if somebody came along and offered them more money, much like free agents do today, right? Although their free agents they're not jumping a contract, but it's a similar, if you think of it that way. If you're earning $350 a month, if we go back to the Negro leagues and that time what they were getting, you're earning $350 a month and someone offers you $500, hey, that's a no-brainer, if you can go play for that other team.
That's right.
So a lot of people have these misconceptions about, the Negro leagues weren't leagues, and the talent. Yeah, I mean, like, so you mentioned we don't want to mythologize or romanticize to the point that some people occasionally go in the total opposite direction and act like practically every player could have been a Hall of Famer. No,
exactly.
They had Hall of Fame players. They had above average players. They had average players. They had below average players, and they had cup of coffee guys, just like every other league.
That's right.
But they were definitely major league players. And it's really, one of the things that is a shame is that we don't know how all these Hall of Famers would have fared against each other prior to integration. How would Babe Ruth have managed having to face Bullet Joe Rogan or Satchel Paige? How many home runs would Josh Gibson have hit off Walter Johnson? I mean, we'll never know. But to say that those guys were not major leaguers is absolutely wrong.
No, I had a great a conversation the other day with Gary Gillette about that, because one of the time periods of Major League Baseball, and it all fascinates me, going all the way back through the history of baseball, back to the, even before it was, just the rule changes. I mean, I had Andrew Nelson on here, he plays vintage baseball up in Minnesota, so we talked about that. I mean, how the rules have changed, and it's funny because before I go on with that thought, I mean, the same people who push back on Negro League statistics not being somehow good enough are okay with 1880 statistics from Major League Baseball, where they were wearing no gloves, pitching from 50 feet,
underhanding the ball,
underhand, 9 balls and 7 strikes or whatever it was. That's all okay. No, those are okay. Those stats are fine. It doesn't make any sense. But anyway, getting back to what I was talking about. So I asked Gary the same question, like, what to him makes a major league? Because the time period that really, really fascinates me is that late 1890s, the rise of the American Association, when it was becoming the American League, and now there was going to be the big baseball civil war, who was going to be a major league. And so eventually the National League, who was the major league at the time, they blinked and they allowed the American League to become a
much
major
to the
league.
chagrin of somebody like John McGraw.
That's right. And so that fascinated me. So I asked Gary, so what makes a major league? Because they recognize Major League Baseball, the Federal League and the Union Association and the Players League. And so to not recognize the Negro leagues, who the only reason that they weren't playing in any of these major leagues is because of the color of their skin, the gentleman's agreement, and the racism that was involved in that, and that was it, simple as that. And so there would be a significant portion, like you just pointed out. That's one thing I try to make sure people know. No one's saying every single Negro leaguer would be in the majors. No. But I'll tell you what, a good chunk of them would be, which means who knows, 10, 20, 30, 40% of Major League Baseball players who were in the majors would not be, because it's zero sum.
And we saw that initially when integration began, right? Yes. I mean, there was still sort of a quota system for a lot of teams, no more than 2 black players. They could room together, and that was your quota. There were some exceptions to that, the Brooklyn Dodgers, obviously, but for the most part, a lot of those guys that could have made it, still didn't get an equal
Exactly.
shot because there was still a quota system. But look at how many black players made it to the major
And
leagues,
what happened when they
and
did?
especially then when we get into the 1960s and the 1970s, you know, that seemed to be the height of the era then. And how many were playing in the minor leagues that, like I said, didn't get a fair shot at making the major leagues. It was often a one-time thing. That was actually what happened to Bill Grieston. Since I mentioned him earlier, he got a brief tryout. Basically, I call it that, a tryout with the Cardinals. For one thing, he had to take a pay cut. Usually when you get promoted to the major leagues, right, that's a pay raise.
Right.
They told him he was taking a pay cut, and his choice was, you know, deal with it or you're not going to come up to the majors.
Wow.
He got in 3 games, was not an instant success. You know, he wasn't Bob Gibson right away or something like that. And that was it. They sent him back to the minors.
Who was that with?
He pitched in
Who was that
with
with?
the St. Louis Cardinals.
With the Cardinals.
Yeah, with the Cardinals. Now, you know, everybody's trying to right certain wrongs. In more recent history, the Cardinals had invited him back. Trying to remember the exact year, might have been 2014 or so, somewhere around there maybe, to throw out the first pitch of the game. Oklahoma City, Bill Grieston was the first black player in the state of Oklahoma when he played for Oklahoma City's minor league team at the time. They honored him around that same time. So, you know, a lot has been done to try to recognize some of these players, including in particular Bill Grieston here. But the fact of the matter is, again, that he really didn't get a fair shot in the majors. You know, most guys are going to get more than 3 games. And even if they get 3 games and get shelled a couple of times and get sent to the minors, if the team's got a lot invested in them, they're going to try to bring them back up again later, give them a second chance, see if they've adjusted and can do better. But that usually didn't happen for these black players. If you weren't Willie Mays, you know, or Jackie Robinson, Hank Aaron, if you didn't have that degree of success instantly, you could forget about your second chance when integration first started. That's what happened to Johnny Wright as well, you know.
No, it's interesting that all of this, and that's why I'm having these conversations, is to try to give that kind of context to all that's going on, because it's going to be a lot of overload here. There's going to be a lot of sensory overload, you know, with all of the announcements and all of that's going on, and there's going to be, you know, people trying to sort it all out, right? But you got to put the context. Context matters. It's important here because people need to understand that, like we're talking about, one, they weren't playing because they weren't good enough. They weren't playing because they weren't allowed to, because of the color of their skin. That's number one, right? Number two, even when they were given the opportunity, like you just pointed out, there were limits to maybe some teams. Some teams were very slow. You know, you went to the Red Sox, then waited until 1960 or whatever it was.
Red Sox were the last team to have a black player in the major.
And nothing. I love Pumpsy Green, but you know that's what they decided on, right? So some teams were slow to react. They limited the number per team. Who did they pick? Right? Were they looking for someone who was going to be, you know, acceptable? I mean, what were the criteria that they were putting on? All the conditions that you would never see with a normal process, you know, and that's, people need to understand all that. This was not an easy thing. And during that whole time, even during Jackie Robinson in the 50s and everything else, they were still dealing with the persistent racism and Jim Crow, and where could they drive? Did they have their green book that they could safely stay somewhere?
So many stereotypes.
Yeah. No, it's just.
I mean, if you think of some of the stereotypes, the big thing was, of course, that everybody's always heard is that the reason that Branch Rickey wanted Jackie Robinson is that he trusted him to be able to control his temper and you know, conduct himself properly, that kind of thing. Well, if everybody had to control their temper, Ty Cobb should have been kicked out of the major leagues probably his first year. Right. You know, if you weren't allowed to have any vices, Babe Ruth wouldn't have hit 714 home runs. I mean, that kind of thing they were held to standards
Exactly.
that white players were not held to, which was absurd and just part of the racism and the stereotype.
Exactly. And then, the same thing that people, I don't know how many people, I mean, they're called the Negro Leagues. However, they encompassed a good chunk, and I had Adrian Burgos on here last week, and we talked about this. A good chunk of Latin American players from Cuba, the Dominican, Puerto Rico, you name it, Venezuela, Panama, they all came through the Negro Leagues first. That was that first bridge. And in the early days before Jackie Robinson, if they looked white enough, they might have been given a shot, and they said that they were Cuban or whatever they said, right?
Right.
But
exactly. Light-skinned Cubans were able to make it to the majors, but not dark-skinned. Then you had John McGraw trying to pass off Charlie Grant as a Native American, as Chief Pocahoma.
Things that
and
nobody...
nonsense like that, and that's another thing. That's another story. Every Native American player, it seemed, got the nickname Chief, right? Another stereotype.
That's right.
Chief Bender and so forth.
You got it. No, it's really, and some of that stuff is some of it's cute. Some of the nickname stuff is cute, but there's some of the racial things. Some of them were a little harsh. It was a different time than it is today, and you know what? It's interesting, right? Because at this point, it is what it is, and no one's saying you have to white out the past and make it like it didn't happen. You have to understand it happened. Right. And then you have to, learn from that and make it the future going forward better. And that's what it's all about. You can't, streamline everything and make everything perfect because nothing's perfect. The history is not perfect. It's not pretty sometimes, and you have to learn from it. So,
and when you read the stories of these Negro leaguers, I think. I want to say that one of the other, sometimes, again, the history can get romanticized a little bit in retrospect now. And there's always a lot of talk about they played for the love of the game. Well, yeah, but I think anybody of any race or color, ethnicity, whatever, that's ever played baseball has loved the game.
Yes.
They definitely did. They also played for the money. Satchel Paige is a perfect example of that, right? I mean, Satchel went where the money was. And even in the Negro Leagues, their salaries, not being commensurate to what white major leaguers were making, still they were making more money than most other black people were, unless you happen to be a top entertainer or a very successful businessman within the black business world. You were making, as a black baseball player, far more than the average black person. So let's not romanticize it too much. Yeah. There was money to be had too, but yes, they loved the game. And that, again, I think that's shown by any player. That you see that, you mentioned hard. We're both in the Houston area, and the Sugarland Skeeters, the minor league team that's now the Astros AAA affiliate. Well, they were an independent league club up until this year.
Right.
But there were so many major leaguers that were trying to revive their career. Some of whom did that kind of thing. Other guys who knew they were too old to ever make it back to the majors, but they just didn't want to give up playing. So did these guys love the game, the Negro leaguers? Yes, but everybody has. Yeah. They played wherever they could so that they could continue to play and to draw a good paycheck from playing. And you mentioned the Latin leagues. Wilmer Fields is another player that I've written his Saber biography, got a chance to speak to his youngest son, Wilmer Jr., who goes by the name Billy Fields, and talked to him a little bit. And his dad made more money in Latin America. I think one winter he was making up to $3,000 a month. Now the winter seasons are short, but think of that, $3,000 a month. That's not a bad payday today, really. I mean, maybe not for a pro ball player, but for your average person. Whereas, playing for the Homestead Grays, he was getting maybe $350, $400 a month or something. So the Latin leagues offered a great opportunity as well. Absolutely.
We've touched on this in a couple conversations too. So couple that, right? The fact that they could make in some cases significantly more money, like you pointed out, but also the fact that when they went to these countries, they didn't have to deal with the baloney that they had to deal with back here.
Right.
So it's a no-brainer.
Absolutely.
No.
That's almost to a man. Any interview you read where a black player talks about his time in Latin America, that almost always came up in those interviews, those conversations,
Mm-hmm.
that they were treated as equals.
It's interesting.
And some of them, stayed in those countries where they played. There were several players that lived in Mexico or in Canada, north of the border as well, not just the Latin countries.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have to put up with that in most of Canada. So some of them lived in Canada or Mexico, or maybe they stayed in the Dominican Republic, wherever they enjoyed it the most, that they had played winter ball. But yeah, absolutely, they were equals there, which they were not here. And that was something that Billy Fields had mentioned, that Wilmer Fields, his dad, actually turned down 5 different major league teams after integration, because
Interesting.
just like with Bill Grieston, he would have had to take a pay cut for one thing, and for another, he was enjoying playing in the Latin leagues and the equality that he had in those countries more than what he would have had playing in the white leagues, the minors, or if he made it to the majors in the United States.
That's interesting. That is really, really interesting. My wife is from Guadalajara originally, and I talked about this with Dr. Burgos the other day. And I asked him about that. When these guys went to Latin America to play, how did they manage? Because, I'm learning my Spanish. We make sure, I have 3 boys as well, just like you two. We make sure all our boys are bilingual, right? There's whole weekends where we'll just, my wife will speak nothing but Spanish, just to keep them in practice, right?
Right.
And so
Right.
I asked him what happened when they went to Mexico, or they went to a Caribbean country, and how did they manage? Because I know what it's like when my Spanish is not the greatest, and did they have someone who helped them and so forth? And he had some great insights on that, as far as one of the things that I noticed myself even today. When you go there, if you try to speak Spanish, they applaud you for that. They think it's great. Hey, you're trying. Sometimes if I speak it too well, they think I'm really good, and now I can't keep up and I'm lost, right? So I'm like, oh, no, slow down.
But
but
you get lost.
Yes, but it's interesting because here, I know my wife, being born in Mexico, she still has a little bit of an accent, and so when she talks, you could tell she's from a Latin country, and so people immediately. Now she, like I said, she has a degree in teaching, a degree in special education, a master's in special education. She's teaching these people's kids, but yet because of her accent, or sometimes she'll talk to me in Spanish, people hear that and they think that somehow she's stupid. It's like, no, wait a minute. She speaks a couple of languages. I think it's the other way around, really.
Yeah, that's an odd stereotype too. Exactly.
Right? Yeah, no doubt. It makes no sense to me. I think bilingual is an asset, really. I mean, it's helpful, but anyway, I don't want to get too much. I don't want to get too much.
But that's it. I mean, people come here from other countries, and just like you said with your wife, and they have advanced degrees and who knows what.
Yes.
They've got a degree in engineering or something, but because they're still struggling with English at first, people think, how would you like to be a busboy?
Right.
And they didn't have to deal with that going to Latin countries, and that goes back to when I talked with Carlos. Carlos Robinson is Johnny Wright's youngest daughter. There's great irony in the fact that her married name is Robinson. She's aware of that since her dad and Jackie Robinson were with the Montreal Royals in 1946. But her dad was originally from New Orleans, and had sort of a Creole French side of the family, so he knew French. So when he was in Three Rivers, which was a French-speaking city in Canada, that in 1946, he could speak French there. Nice. He played in the Latin American countries long enough that he got pretty conversant in Spanish, and corresponded in Spanish with some of his Latin teammates.
Awesome.
That kind of thing. So yeah, these guys went around and they picked up the language and the culture where they went to, and I'm sure that went both ways. They appreciated the way they were treated in those countries. And I'm sure that the people there were glad that they, were trying to learn their language and maybe their customs and eat their food and not just come down and play ball and take their money.
That's right. So I've got your the one book up here, The Newark Eagles Take Flight, and if you can talk us through a little bit of the background on this and who was involved in it and how you did your research on this one. One of the things I really find interesting about it is, living here in Houston, how many people in Houston know that this Newark Eagles team became the Houston Eagles? Probably not a lot.
Became the Houston Eagles.
That's right.
Yeah, that book, that was interesting because we published the first one, Bittersweet Goodbye, which was about that 1948 Negro World Series and the Black Barons and the Grays in 2017. And we had the Saber's Jerry Malloy Negro League Conference there. And the book, we try to time these books to coincide with the conference every year. The conference was on hiatus the past couple of years, not just for COVID last year, but some different reasons the past couple of years. This year it's virtual, but we kept on with the books. But after that first one, it came out with at the time of the Jerry Malloy Conference, and Rich Perzer, who you had on here recently, he had mentioned to us that their chapter up there in New Jersey, in that area where Newark would be, their Negro League team for the area where their Saber chapter is, they had tried to get something like that going 10 years earlier. And for whatever reasons, different things happen, people's life circumstances change, whatever situation happens, the effort had kind of petered out. But since we had got that first one done, he thought, he asked us, would you be interested in reviving this one? We said, absolutely, especially since some of the work had already been done. We just had to go back and see how many people were still members. And so we did this. We do the same thing with every book. We try to write. We have to determine sometimes there are different sources. We use seam heads primarily, but we also go to things like the Negro Leagues book, which Larry Lester has co-edited both of those volumes. And James Riley's biographical encyclopedia, which is getting a little bit dated, but it's still a good starting point. Sometimes we determine who's on the roster. Sometimes we find guys that played one or two games, and wow, okay, a new find. Other times guys that supposedly were on the roster were not. It was a different year or whatever. So we determine the roster, and then we try to get biographies of all those players. Now, some of them are such cup of coffee guys that they can't be found. With every book, there's been at least one or two such players. But we can find most of them, especially with all the material available these days. So we try to write, the Saber biographies of all of these players. And then we try to find notable games. Since we're dealing primarily with championship teams, we deal with the playoffs or World Series or both, depending on what the situation was in the leagues at that time, and then provide a lot of context for their region, context for their time period, and that sort of thing, and have feature articles, so this is what life was like in Newark. This is the history of the Newark Eagles, all those types of things. And that's what we did with that. And we've developed a core of, Saber's got different committees. And so there's the Negro Leagues Committee and the Biography Project committees are where we've primarily drawn members from. And there's a good core of people that like to write about this that have signed up for just about every book. But we try to get new people involved too. So, we always put the word out when there's a new book project. This is what we've got available. Or if you have your own idea for a feature article, or you find a noteworthy game, please submit it to us, and obviously it's your idea and we go with it. You got first dibs on researching and writing that up, that sort of thing. So that was the second. And after those two, there were so many people interested in it that we've kept it going. Number 3 was the Pittsburgh Crawfords last year. Number 4, the Kansas City Monarchs, has just been published. And as I mentioned, we're already working on 2 more, for next year in 2023.
So I just put up Bittersweet Goodbye. You touched on this one a little bit about the final Negro Leagues World Series. What I think is interesting about these is, and Rich talked about this when he was on as well, but the fact that you guys are basically writing a little biography about everybody involved with the team, player, I'm sure front office and everything else, so people can get a feel for who
exactly.
these guys were. And that's a lot of fun, because that's the one thing about the Negro Leagues that especially, and I guess it's true of Major League Baseball as well. I mean, you tend to hear about the Babe Ruths and the Ted Williamses and the bigger stars way more than you do most of the next tiers down, right? But it's kind of fun to be able to become part of that team in a sense, right? You get to learn who, but what you just said I thought was really, really cool, that you actually are adding some flavor to it as the time period and what the city was like, and that's cool, because that's another thing about all this. Context is important. You've got to understand what time period you're dealing with here in order to really understand the whole story. It's cool.
Yeah, and like you said, I'm glad you mentioned that. We do cover the front office personnel, the owners, whoever else. Usually they had player managers, but if they had somebody on rare occasion who was just the field manager, personnel directors. We've even done, announcers. We do the stadiums. We write up the stadiums in which they played. And of course, most Negro League teams didn't have their own stadium. The Pittsburgh Crawfords were one of the rare exceptions to that. They had Greenlee Field for most of their existence once Gus Greenlee purchased the team. So we cover the stadium. When we did the Crawfords book, Gus Greenlee also owned clubs, the Crawford Grills. There were 3 different iterations of the Crawford Grills, and they were the place to be in Pittsburgh. And I mean, entertainers came through, the top black entertainers and the ball players and everybody who was anybody, in black Pittsburgh hung out at the Crawford Grill. So yeah, that's the type of context stuff we try to provide as well.
That's fun stuff. So in the Newark Eagle book, you talk about the Newark Eagle franchise, and in Bittersweet Goodbye, I'm assuming you must touch on both teams involved then, right?
Yeah, we did. That was that was a massive undertaking to do both of those teams. And all the context. We've stuck to one team at a time since then. But I'm really proud of all the books because of the effort that so many of the people, so many of the contributors put into it in terms of contacting family members and some of the material we received. One of I mentioned, I think, getting to meet Jim Zapp, who was a Birmingham Black Barons outfielder on that 48 team. And I've gotten to know his son, and his daughter, but especially he had 2 sons and a daughter. I've gotten to know James Zapp Jr. Cool. Turns out that he lives about 15 miles from my mom. So we often get together. And while Jim Zapp, the ball player, was still alive, unfortunately he had Alzheimer's. But James took me out to visit with his dad at the nursing home that he was in at the time. And I knew my own dad, I had been through that with my own dad. And I sat there and remembered that, my dad could tell you what happened 50 years earlier, like it happened yesterday. He didn't know if he ate breakfast, but 50 years ago was clear as a bell. And so I started with that and got Jim talking about when he was stationed at Pearl Harbor during World War II. Cool. And played on the IA barracks team out there, and played against guys like Pee Wee Reese and all that sort of thing. And after we left, James said to me, I didn't know half of that stuff. He said, where'd all that come from? Is all that real? I said, yeah, that's the thing. I mean, Pee Wee Reese was out there. He played ball. He was at Pearl Harbor, but before he got sent off to the Pacific, and to combat in the Pacific and all that kind of thing. I said, absolutely. And he said, I never heard half of that.
That's wild.
And James and I have kept in touch since then. But when his dad passed away, Willie Mays and Bill Grieston were the only Black Barons teammates left. And I didn't know until that time that Jim Zapp and Willie Mays had become lifelong friends, and I mean good friends. They traveled together and all that kind of thing. And Willie Mays couldn't make it to the funeral. He's in declining health himself, but he wrote a 2-page letter that James's sister read at the funeral. And James said, "Hey, I talked to Willie about this, and he's okay with it. If you guys want to run this letter from him in the book, it's good." And so, it's in the book, obviously.
Wow.
and Willie Mays goes back and reminisces about when he was a 17-year-old on the Black Barons, and tells stories about how he used to have to catch the bus. And one day the bus would stop and he'd run to try to get to the door, and then they'd drive a little further. And they kept him running after the bus like that for a while. So when he got on the bus, Jim Zapp was just cracking up about them doing that to Willie Mays. So just great stories in there, and talks about their lifelong friendship. And that was so generous of James and his family and of Willie Mays to allow us to publish that. And we've gotten so many different things. I got a letter from Kirk Bruce, who's an associate athletic director at the University of Pittsburgh. And his dad, Clarence Bruce, was a second baseman for that 1948 Homestead Grays. And his mom kept a scrapbook. So he sent me what he could. He said, "Some things I'm afraid to take out and scan. I don't want to." I said, "Yeah, don't tear anything up." But he sent me a copy of one of his dad's contracts with the Grays. He sent me a letter from the Cleveland Indians offering his dad a tryout based on the recommendation of Harry Suitcase Simpson, because Bruce and Simpson had played against each other in the Negro Leagues. And just so much neat stuff. He sent me a photo of some of the players taken at Forbes Field. And and others have done that too. I mean, not to go on too long, but one of the neatest stories I think we got was Jimmy Newberry, who was the ace pitcher for the 48 Black Barons. The Saber member Jeb Stewart, who wrote Newberry's biography, managed to, we did some digging and we found some descendants. And so Jeb took it from there. And he got a neat story from a nephew who said that Jimmy Newberry also wound up playing for the St. Louis. Well, he was signed by the St. Louis Browns, I should say, by Bill Veeck. And Bill Veeck sent Newberry to Japan. He was one of the first 2 black players to play in Japan after World War II. And so Newberry and Veeck became lifelong friends. And Newberry settled near Chicago after he was done playing ball. And he could go to Comiskey and see the White Sox anytime he wanted, that sort of thing. So when he died, he was cremated, and he wanted his ashes to be spread at Comiskey Park. Well, I can imagine that, if you asked anybody that, the answer would be no, right? You're not going to just spread your relatives' ashes on our ball field. So this nephew said what he did was at an early season game, when the weather was still cool up there in Chicago, he took the urn with the ashes and put it in the inside pocket of a heavy coat. And he got himself a front row seat at the outfield. And he said, and whenever some play happened and everybody stood up and was watching what's going on, I'd lean over and pour some of those ashes down on the warning track.
Oh my goodness, that's awesome.
To honor Newberry's wishes.
Oh my goodness, that is awesome. I can't, yeah. There's so many cool stories, man. I'll tell you what, just doing the research and what makes this really fun, I think, I would imagine for you guys as well, is when to have a eulogy from Willie Mays. I mean, this is not something that you're reading about. This is something you physically have in your hand, and to hear the stories from people's mouths, and that is just a lot of fun. I think that all of that is really important to giving people some of the context. I think that a lot of this, because this is going to go on for a long time. I mean, they're going to be digging
Oh yeah.
in, and they're going to be digging into the Negro Leagues, and they're going to be trying to get things right. I mean, that was one of the things that I think has been really interesting, and I hope people get it, is yes, the Negro Leagues are major leagues. The decision had to be made. The timing was right for doing it over this past year. And will they continue to work at it? Yes, there's going to be ongoing work, but that doesn't mean you should not do it.
And even once we get past, like you say, it's going to be a long time. There are still box scores to be tracked down, players to be tracked down that we don't know a lot about. And that's one of the things why we write a biography of every player possible in each of these books. We don't just want to do the Hall of Famers and like I said, maybe should be Hall of Famers. If a guy had one at bat and we can find out information about him, he's going in the book so that we can tell the story. And people do that with the Saber biography project, right? With the major league players. A lot of times for a fan, your favorite player may not necessarily be the big star on the team. He's the backup who signed an autograph for you or something like that, or who had a bright, shining moment in a game you attended or in a playoff or whatever the case might be. And so we're trying to get all these players written up. But once these leagues that are considered major league have been covered to the extent, that we can, then it's time to go and look at the leagues that I suppose if these 7 leagues were major leagues, well, then those others were the equivalent of minor leagues.
There you go.
And let's look at those leagues like the West Coast Negro Baseball Association and leagues like that. And let's find out everything we can about those leagues.
Because they dotted the country.
This can go on for a long time.
They dotted the country. I mean, and the fact that, like we've been talking about, in the early days, I mean, so the 1920 Negro National League was not the first effort to make an organized Negro League. I mean, there were several other efforts, made prior, in the decades prior. But, even here in Texas, it was interesting to find out that, in the late 1890s, there was a Texas Negro League that didn't last very long.
Right.
But,
and then a Texas-Louisiana League.
Yes,
exactly.
They dot the country. They are everywhere, literally. And I think it's going to be really a lot of fun as this goes forward, as these things are uncovered, and whatever documentation. That's going to be the hard part, is trying to find concrete things like statistics. I think there's some stories that can be told because there are accounts, there are newspapers and things. Finding statistics is going to be a little bit more difficult, but
and you mentioned the Newark Eagles moving to Houston and becoming Houston Eagles, and I'm looking here. There's Rob Fink, and I'm not sure. I believe he's a college professor somewhere in Texas. I want to say Abilene, but I'm not sure, so I don't want to. But he wrote a book called Playing in Shadows, which is about Negro League baseball in Texas. Cool. And there's a lengthy chapter that focuses on the Houston Eagles. And he mentioned, though, that that there was an African-American paper in Houston, the Houston Informer, and they were the ones who primarily covered the team more than the Houston Chronicle at that time. But he mentioned that the Informer covered them pretty well in 1948, but they never really caught on. Nobody knew who most of the players were, and some of the star players had no interest going from New Jersey to Texas. That was a different ball game, literally and figuratively. They didn't want to come down and play in Texas. Guys like Leon Day, for instance. And so they were missing some of the star ball players, and they didn't know, who most of the rest of the players were. And the team never caught on. And then the Informer almost stopped covering them altogether in 1949. Or I'm sorry, in 1950, rather, I should say. In 49, they covered them pretty well. And then in 1950, they stopped. They moved to New Orleans for one more year and played there, and then the team folded. But when you mentioned trying to find, he says, if there were going to be game write-ups and box scores of a Houston-based Negro League team, they should have been in the Houston Informer. But even the Houston Informer lost interest in covering that team and wrote very little about them during the second year that they were here in the city of Houston.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of that, unfortunately, is just lost. You might find a brief article when they went on the road and played a team elsewhere that maybe the local paper there covered them. But once integration started, then there was very little cover. We found that out with the 1948 Negro World Series. That was the last Negro World Series. Excuse me. And it was the third time in the 40s that the Black Barons and Grays were playing each other in the Negro World Series. Mm-hmm. And you would have thought that that would be a pretty big deal. But Larry Doby and Satchel Paige were playing for the Cleveland Indians in the Major League World Series. Mm-hmm. And even the black press covered that in great detail and largely neglected those Negro League World Series games. The clinching game of the Negro League World Series, there's about a 1 or 2 paragraph write-up in a line score. I talked to Larry Lester one time, and he still thinks that there's a box score out there somewhere. And I thought, well, that's the holy grail if there is, because nobody's found it yet. I think Larry's still holding out hope that it's out there somewhere, but I have my doubts at this point. Mm-hmm. That was it. Everybody was focused on Doby and Page, and they were playing for the Indians in the World Series.
It's interesting. That's why that title of that book is kind of lots of meanings to that, because by the time the late 40s, after Jackie Robinson, certainly by 49 into the 50s, the Negro Leagues were a declining league as far as its stature, coverage, fans wanted to be interested in them, because, like you pointed out, these guys were all going to the major leagues. That's where they wanted to see them do well. And I could understand that. But that had to be something that was always in the back of their minds, knowing that once it started, it was going to be the end of an era, so to speak. I mean, it's unfortunate in a way.
And we got that title. I came up with that title from a quote I found from Bill Grieston in another interview. And he talked about how during that 48 season that there was a sadness, that they saw the handwriting on the wall for the end of this, and knew that some of them were too old, were past their prime, were not going to get the opportunity. Mm-hmm. Some of them, like we said, not every Negro League player would have been a major leaguer. Some of them knew, hey, I'm not, I'm facing stiffer competition, more and stiffer competition. I'm not likely to make it. And that's why some of them hung on by going to Canada and to the Latin leagues. But the Negro National League folded after the 1948 season. Mm-hmm. The Homestead Grays joined the Negro American League, I think, for one season. In 49, they tried, I think they were going to try barnstorming in 50, but they just disbanded. Mm-hmm. And those franchises that were still viable, that's when the Newark Eagles got sold, because they were part of the Negro National League. That's when they were sold to Houston, was after the 48 season, so they didn't fold. Some of the other franchises that didn't fold joined the Negro American League, and it hung on for a while. But the quality of play in the Negro Leagues declined with each year, because obviously their best players were being signed away. Yeah,
because these guys were not just even being signed to go to the major leagues; they were being signed, and many of them were going into the now the here before white minor leagues. Because
exactly.
So the talent pipeline was now shifted, and it's unfortunate. It's kind of a but yeah, I'm sure they could see that coming. What was going to happen. But so tell us about the Summer of Sabre. I know they got some events coming up at the end of this month, right?
Right. Yeah, that's COVID. Obviously has done a number on
last year,
all gatherings, and as you mentioned, last year, especially being unable to the Negro League Baseball Museum and everybody else, Sean Gibson's Josh Gibson Foundation in Pittsburgh, all these organizations that wanted to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the Negro National League, which was the first of those 7 Negro major leagues between 1920 and 48. All that was on hiatus. Saber's annual conference that was supposed to take place in Baltimore was postponed last year. Now it's going to be virtual this year. That's part of Summer of Sabre. The annual Jerry Malloy Conference, I mentioned that various things, not just COVID last year, but some circumstances, I said people's life circumstances among those individuals who do all the heavy lifting on organizing that. I'm definitely not one of those people where that's concerned. That's Larry Lester and Leslie Heafy and a few other people that do that. But that's going to be virtual, and that's coming up this month, at the end of this month as well. So there's a lot of different things. They've had the Women in Baseball has been a big focus, and there's been that conference. And so, the thing about virtual, I don't know how many people are exhausted from virtual things, but the neat thing about the virtual thing is you pay a lot less to register for it, right? You don't have to worry about your travel expenses on top of your registration. Registration's a lot less expensive. You don't have to worry about your travel and your hotel and all that sort of thing. And you still have the benefit of attending whichever sessions you want to attend.
So tell people, so let's before, so some of these are coming up, I think it's the 25th, somewhere around in there of July for a few days. Right. Tell people how they can become a Saber member and what they're going to get out of that, because there's some pretty cool little perks here.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Just go to the Saber website, which is SABR, the acronym. Saber, of course, is for those who aren't familiar with the organization, Society for American Baseball Research. So just go to saber.org, SABR.org, and you can, find the link to join. And you've got options. Most people want to try it out and do a 1-year membership. I think we've got some 3-year membership options as well. There are discounts for seniors and that sort of thing. So you just have to look and see, what suits you, your age category, what you want to try out for. But the perks, absolutely. The books that you mentioned that we write, and Saber comes out on average with about one book per month. So 12 books a year. And as a Saber member, you get the ebook versions free. So if you're happy with ebook, you're absolutely free of charge, right? And there are different versions. There's the Amazon Kindle version. There's a couple other different. You can download a PDF version if you don't have any of those ebook readers. That alone makes it worth the membership. Absolutely. If you're like me and you still like to have a book in hand, you can get, as a Saber member, you get a 50% discount on the paperback version. You get discounts for registrations to the conference conferences that we've mentioned. And Saber has more than just the annual summer conference and then the Jerry Malloy Women in Baseball. There's Arizona Fall League Conference, the Analytics Conference. There's almost a conference a month practically too. So you get discounts on that as a member. Excuse me. Also, if you want to become involved in any of these efforts, any Saber member becomes eligible to contribute to write a biography of a player, write up a game. You just have to get approval, make sure it's not one that's been written yet, right? And do that. And to help you with your research, Saber has, you get access to the paper of record, which has all the sporting news archives. And now, just recently, within I think about 2 months ago or so, if it's been that long, you get access to newspapers.com.
That's right.
Which is normally something that you would have to either go to a library where you can use it free, or if you wanted to have it at home, then you would have to subscribe to it.
That's right.
But now that's another benefit of membership. So you have a lot of research resources at hand there already.
Very nice.
To help you if you're interested in writing, and you can try to write for a book project. Announcements are made for those and the topics that are available when they come out. But Saber's also got the biography project and games project websites, so you don't have to write for a book. And if you're into more instant gratification, which sometimes that's me, I've already written stuff for this book that's not going to get published for 2 years. And I thought, well, I want to see something hit the website. So I just finished a biography that's in the editing, fact-checking process now, and will get posted immediately to the biography project website. And I do that as well. So there's instant gratification and long-term gratification. And the gratification is that you are adding to the knowledge of baseball history, right?
That's right.
You do the digging, you do the research, you write about this player or this particular game, and you know, Saber has become so well known that other researchers who write books and that sort of thing, they get on Saber and they look at the player biographies on the Saber biography website. They look at what's been published in these Saber books. Every once in a while, somebody will bring to my attention. I think the oddest thing was there was a book that came out about baseball and the law, and it cited my Saber biography of Roger Clemens in a couple of instances. So, you know, here these guys, these are two lawyers writing a book about baseball and the law. They're citing my Saber biography of a particular player. So, you know, Saber has acknowledged that members do outstanding research and that you can trust what you read there.
And what I think is fun, and I hope people take this to heart, is if you're a baseball fan and you want to write about whatever it is that made you a baseball fan, whether it's vintage baseball from the early days, whether it's, you know, some time period, your local team, whether that team is a major league team or not, a player who's from your hometown, and like you said, if they haven't been written about already.
Right, because I'm sorry, I neglected to mention there's also 2 annual issues of the Baseball Research Journal, and that's where you can address a lot of the other topics like you just mentioned. So they even have recently, only within the past, this is the second full year of it, there's a journal dedicated that comes out twice a year to creative writing about baseball. So short stories, poetry, that sort of thing. So if you want to write about baseball, there's an outlet for you to write about baseball on Saber.
And I encourage people to go do it. I mean, everybody has a passion. If you're a baseball fan, sometimes it goes really, really deep. As far as what made you that way, right?
Absolutely.
And if you want to write and tell other people and hope and people will enjoy what you're writing, go do it, because there is so much out there that can be written about from your particular viewpoint, because that's the thing, right? I mean, I don't know what's in somebody's head. They are telling that story, and that's what makes it really a lot of fun.
The other great thing is too, I mentioned that, you know, people know you can trust what's on Saber, but that's not to say that we're infallible.
Sure.
And especially sometimes when you're dealing with a primary source that you figure, well, it's been vetted, it's gone through an editorial process, I can trust it, and it turns out something is incorrect. And there's nothing, you know, some people are afraid. I've had people say, oh, I'd never want to write something that other people would read. I thought, well, isn't that the idea? You know,
right.
I want people to read it. I want to share it. I want people to read it.
That's right.
But, you know, sometimes you come up, I wrote a biography that was straight to the biography project, and it was a primary source that I too figured had been, you know, vetted, and that I could trust it and that I could include it. And I had a ball player, not the ball player that I wrote about, but a teammate of his, contact me via email, and then we talked on the phone, and he said, hey, I want to clear up some misinformation that's in this. And I appreciated that. I said, absolutely. You know, he said, I don't know what this guy wrote that I wouldn't know about this or that, but let me tell you the whole story. And then I felt bad because I get on Baseball Reference and I'm looking at player transactions and stuff, and I'm like, well, yeah, you know, but I didn't think, honestly, in that instance, I trusted the primary source, and maybe I should have dug deeper. That was on me. But I was so glad that this ball player called me, and it was really cool. And then he sent me all kinds of pictures of stuff. He had played in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, started in the minors in the 60s, played into the 80s. He sent me all kinds of pictures from his playing days and stuff like that.
Cool.
You know, he wasn't mad at me or anything. He was doing me a favor.
Absolutely.
You know? And so I fixed it in the biography. We fixed it on the website, posted the corrected biography, and you know, I got to know a major league ball player and got all kinds of cool pictures and conversations.
Very cool. Well, Rick, this was a lot of fun. I appreciate your time. When you're further along, when you have you know, something else that you're working on, we'll get you back on here and we can talk about it. I'm more than happy to have you come on and talk about whatever you guys want to talk about that are into this, because
That
I think
sounds
it's important to get these stories out there on players, teams, you name it, and
that sounds great. I tell you what, we'll definitely get in touch when we publish the book next year about the 1920 Chicago American Giants.
awesome.
Rube Foster, the owner and who founded the Negro National League, was a native Texan.
Yes, he was.
And I took it upon myself his biography had been written already, as you might expect, for Saber, but I took it upon myself to write the biographies of the 4 Texans on the team. And there are some interesting stories, especially
sure.
about one Dave Brown.
That's
So
right.
I'll save that. I'll save
Lefty
Dave Brown for next year when that book comes out,
Lefty
and
Brown,
just leave that
yeah.
out there as a teaser. But that's one of Dave Brown is one of the all-time great baseball stories. Dave Brown's story.
Yes, he is. We'll save that for you to tell us a little bit more about that when your book comes out. But yes, I do know some of it. I'm sure I don't know much of it, but I know
You're
it's
familiar with some of it. Yeah,
I'm familiar, and
okay.
it's interesting. So I appreciate your time. This was a lot of fun, and like I said, we'll have you on here again down the road.
That's great. Thanks a lot for having me on again. I've enjoyed it.
All right, man. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.